Hey, I'm ZSH Plays, and today we're going to be building an entire aquatic zoo all in one episode. It's called the Wetlands, Florida. I really hope you enjoy it. For this zoo, we are in the Everglades in Florida, and we're going to be building a wetland zoo to go in this environment, which is very suitable for it. And the concept is that a consortium or a group or a society or whatever has bought a massive area of the Everglades in order to protect it. So much of the Everglades have no protection whatsoever and they are suffering pretty badly. So in order to finance protecting this enormous area, they've taken a small area of it and turned it into a zoo. That's my concept anyway. I've already built this habitat, another habitat for one of our new animals that I am really excited about. It's probably my favourite new animal in the pack, which will be coming up very soon, possibly even today. And I've built the entrance as well. We're going to take a look at the entrance a little bit later because I wanted to dive straight into one of the new animals. So I think in episode 3 we're going to take a look at the huge entrance area that I've built. But yeah, I've been pretty busy for the past 2 weeks getting all this done. I'm really happy with how it's turning out. So this is where the capybara are going to live. They're going to have 2 big pools to swim around in. We have 2 paths running between them for the guests with this natural sort of wood chip effect. Just making a little sign to tell the guests what they really should already know. Going to be doing some custom curbs on the path because the in-game ones are a bit too big for my liking. This took a long time. Curved paths and your own curbs are always a bit of a nightmare to do, but it's worth it, I think, to make it look exactly the way that I wanted it to look. And it's going to be a really, really big habitat. I found in my research that capybara live in groups of up to 20, including the babies, which is pretty huge. So we're going to have a big old group of them in here. So I want loads of room for them and loads of room for the guests to walk around in and really enjoy this beautiful area. They're going to need quite a big shelter as well. Obviously, the weather's pretty clement in the Everglades. But they have storms and all sorts there, as well as it being nice and warm. So they're going to need a big shelter. And I'm going to be going way out of my comfort zone with some of the builds in this zoo. If you see my channel, you know that 20th century modernism is my favourite architectural style to build in. Not really appropriate in a zoo like this. So we're going to have some properly modern builds. And we're going to also have some much more rustic builds like this. This is based on a flamingo shelter in Gatorland in Florida. And it's going to be built out of painted wood. As you can see, we're going to have actual designs painted on it, all sorts of colours. This is going to look very different to what I normally build, and it's been a lot of fun working out how to build this. I should give a big shout out as well to my good friend Beezy, who I leaned on quite heavily with some advice on this build when I wasn't quite happy with how it was looking. He gave me some great advice, which you will see in the final build in the cinematics at the end. Let's talk a bit about the plans for the zoo itself then. So the Wetlands is going to have every single animal from the new DLC in it, of course, and also some of the existing animals that would fit in nicely. I've already got plans for flamingos. Obviously you've got to have flamingos in a zoo, and some of the other animals, maybe the American alligator, would be very fitting. This capybara walkthrough is going to be the second habitat that you get to in the zoo. The first habitat is what we're going to be building in the next episode for the amazing short-clawed otters. And that episode will be out very soon, potentially in a matter of hours, depending on how quickly I can get the otters in there. Back to the build in hand though. So putting some concrete around the bottom to make it look more like it would actually be here and it isn't just sort of a pile of wooden planks. The building I was basing it on, the planks were vertical like this, and I just wasn't happy with the final look. When I looked at the picture again, I realised it was basically just a facade. They just put a load of wood up against what I think is like a concrete shelter. So having looked at that and having spoken to Beezy about it, in the end we put the planks around the other way so they're horizontal as you would expect, and then we're going to put some actual like painted graphics onto it as well, using some of the in-game signs, layering them on top of each other to get different colours in, so it looks more like it's been painted on. If you just rotate one of the pieces slightly behind the other, you get a two-tone effect. And we're going to put a sign on using one of the wonderful Rice's fonts. This is a brilliant font. I really wanted to use this in Tecton Zoo, my main zoo, but it just didn't fit the aesthetic there. So it's been really good to be able to use it in this zoo. I think it fits in perfectly for this more sort of Americana kind of feel that we've got going on. This little feeder on the front of it was made by Zoof. This is off the workshop. I love this piece. I think I've used it before, and you know, when you find something as perfect as this, there's little point in spending hours and hours trying to make it yourself when somebody's already done it. So that goes on there, and then some of these recolored flowers on the floor, like some of the food for the capybara has fallen down there, which is just a nice little detail. I love little touches like that. I think it really brings things to life. If you just shade all the different colours in the flowers to roughly the same shade of brown or green, I guess you could use, you get that sort of fallen leaves or just detritus look. Just putting a load of plants in around there to set it into the landscape, and then we'll start doing a lot of work on the actual habitat itself. It's going to take a whole lot of dring grass and periwinkle leaves and things like that to get it looking good. And I also wanted to make another tree as well. This is, I think, a different type of cypress that you find in Florida, and I just love these. I think they're just the leaves on the tree, or maybe the tree and moss sort of coexist, I'm not sure, but it has all these fronds hanging down. So again, I've used a couple of different trees and a whole load of the Spanish moss and a few other bits and pieces to replicate the tree in the reference photo that I was looking at, just so that we get a sort of richer look to the backdrop. Also, these cypress trees, I think they are deciduous trees, but they look a lot like pines, although they have this unique structure at the bottom that I built. And I was worried, obviously because we don't have them in the game and I am actually using pine trees, that it wouldn't look sort of tropical enough with that Florida vibe. So I wanted a different type of tree in there as well. And then we mix in a lot of other trees that they do have in Florida or closely related, custard apples, mangrove apples and things like that. And then we're going to put some guest gates in and some fences so that the guests can actually walk through this exhibit. I've never used the guest gates before. I think I tried to put them into Tecton once and just got rid of them because they didn't fit, but they actually look really good here because they really fit the vibe that we're going for in this zoo, which is a lot more natural than normal. If you're a fan of modernism though, don't worry, the entrance building and the next habitat that we're building are going to be a lot more modern looking. I want a real mix in this zoo of high-end designed habitats and then also much more natural looking, really beautiful walk-through habitats like this. Just doing a bit of terrain painting there to suggest a little path where the capybara might walk along. I cannot wait to see them in this habitat. I don't have early access to the DLC, so as I'm building this and as I'm recording this, I've not actually seen them in this habitat yet, but they do have capybara at my local zoo, and this habitat is partly inspired by that habitat, though this one has the advantage of being set in Florida rather than the north of England, so it's a lot more lush foliage and things like that in here, but I've modelled it slightly on that. That habitat actually has loads of different South American species in it. They've got the Guti and Mara and a few little monkeys as well. It'd be great to have a sort of mixed species habitat here one day as well. Just putting some custom benches in, just using the aquatic benches and then covering them up with some concrete so they look a bit less themed. They're just a bit too nautical looking for me, those benches, so we'll make some custom ones. But benches are always so much better when the guests can actually use them and you can see them sitting on them. And now we're going to put the horizontal wooden planks over the top of this building, which is what really brings it a sense of realism, which I thought it was missing before. I think this looks really good now when it's done, so thanks to Beezy for pointing that out. I also did some work on the inside of the habitat, making all the pieces on the inside slightly darker than the pieces on the outside to make it look a bit more natural, because sometimes the lighting engine in this game is kind of weird when it comes to indoors. Things indoors with no windows are just as bright as they are outside, which looks a bit weird. So did a bit of work there to make that look more natural. And then the final thing that we're going to do is build some little huts for the capybara to put around the habitat, so they've got places to get away from the guests when they want a bit of privacy, maybe somewhere to have a little snooze. They do seem to spend a lot of their time just chilling out from what I've seen of them. They're not the most active of animals, although when they are active, they are very cool to watch, especially being semi-aquatic. So just put a few of these around, and then I'm going to use one and modify it as the sort of main sign for the habitat, which is going to be in the central area. So it's one of the first things that the guests see when they come in, and really just sets the scene and gives the habitat its name. If you watch my channel, you know I like to have a name for my habitats, normally something quite cheesy and alliterative. I don't know why I like that so much, but I do. So we're going to have Capybara Country here, which I think is a lovely name for this habitat. And then I'm just going to make a few tweaks to these planks, because I decided that the weird sort of up and down height thing that I was going for wasn't really working for me. So I decided to make all the planks twice as thick and all the same height, and just go for a much simpler build there. Obviously we'll cover it in decals to age it, and that is the build pretty much done. So I'm going to go and get me some capybara and add them into the habitat. And here they are. Time for build number 2. Today we're building a habitat for one of my favourite animals in the world, the short-clawed otter. I absolutely love these guys, and I cannot wait to get this built. This is the first habitat that you're going to come to in this zoo. This building is going to be much more architectural than the capybara habitat. It's going to be all soaring white concrete and loads of glass viewing windows for the guests. We're going to have underwater viewing, a shelter for them, and everything that we need for the little otters to be as happy as possible. The Asian short-clawed otter is the smallest of the otter species, and probably my favourite as well. They have them in London Zoo, and I've been going to see them since I was very little indeed. And yeah, they're just impossibly cute, very active, very noisy, and great to watch. So I cannot wait to get them into this habitat. And the habitat itself is actually going to be influenced by the habitat at London Zoo. It's not going to look anything like it at all, but in terms of the layout and the way that some of it works, it's going to be quite similar to that. It's split into land area and then an underwater viewing area with a slight depression in the ground for the guests in front of the underwater viewing, so that you can get better views of them. But it's all sort of joined together into one whole, and then there's going to be a shelter at the back for them. And what I'm doing here is just laying out the basic sort of shape of the habitat. The big arch in the middle is just there to get the sort of scale and the curves that I want. That's not actually going to be in the final build. We're just sort of laying out the outside, making sure the size is correct and everything else. I want this to be a really attractive habitat, because this is going to be sort of the centerpiece of the zoo. I always like to have a sort of centerpiece habitat, which is the first thing that you get to, and I always like that to have water in it, because it's interesting and it looks nice, especially against the white concrete. You can get a really good look. So the first habitat in Tecton Zoo is Penguin Palace for the king penguins. The first habitat in Pamoja Wildlife Park was the Penguin Lagoon for the African penguins, and now we're going to have the Otter Pool. So the path from the entrance will lead straight here. The guests will be able to see it through the entrance, and then when they get here, once they've finished looking at the otters, they will then have a path going to the left and the right, and they can choose where they go next in the zoo. Off to the left will take them up to the capybara walkthrough. To the right will take them to another habitat, and it will just make sure that not everyone is walking the same direction around the zoo and causing congestion. So just putting the barriers in. I'm using all glass at the moment. The ones that you see at the back will be turned into null barriers eventually. And then I'm putting in an internal set of glass barriers here to create the water pool. And then I'm going to build the terrain up and get rid of most of the glass, and the few bits that remain will be covered up with rocks so it looks natural. You won't be able to see any barriers at all where the glass is, apart of course from the long sheet of glass across the front of it for the guests to see into. And then the rest of it is going to be the land for the otters. We will delete sections of this wall at the front to provide the viewing windows for the guests, so they can see the otters pretty much all the way across the front of the habitat, on land on the left, underwater in the middle, and then on land again on the right. If you didn't catch episode 1, just to catch you up on the concept for this zoo, this is set in the Everglades in Florida to conserve a much larger part of the Everglades. That's the concept here, and this zoo will have every single one of the new Wetlands animal pack animals in it, along with some of the other animals that would be appropriate for this kind of environment. Episodes are normally on Saturday on this channel, but I've been working like crazy to get these two out today. Episode 3 will be out this Saturday, where we're going to take a look at the entrance and surrounding area that I've not really shown yet. It's already built, and then we will get on to another habitat for one of the new animals. So make sure you subscribe down below if you want to see that, or check out my other zoo, Tecton Zoo, which is the main zoo on this channel. But anyway, let's get back to this build. So I've finished off the walls at the front, and now we're going to tidy up this pool area, make the glass as low as we can possibly get it, and then start covering up with rocks, so we get a sort of natural looking pool here. Obviously it wouldn't actually be a natural pool, it'd be man-made, but like any zoo, you're going to want to try and make it look as natural as possible and make it fit into the habitat, so that the otters look like they have a nice natural environment to live in. So I'm using loads of different types of rocks, concentrating on the mossy rocks underwater, and then the not mossy rocks above the waterline, so it looks more natural. And we're going to use some decals and things like that as well to put in a water line and some moss and things like that to meld the land and the water together, and just as many rocks as I can throw at it to make it look less regular. I tend to use the natural rocks rather than the faux rocks for builds like this. I don't really like the way the faux rocks look, and I get that is pretty much what you normally see in zoos. Most zoos will use the sort of poured concrete or just fiberglass fake rocks, and Planet Zoo replicates those really well. But if your zoo's got a high enough budget, then you would, or I would anyway, if I was making one, use either real rocks that have been transported or really realistic rocks. So I tend to use the natural rocks more often than I use the faux rocks. Just tend to use the faux rocks if I've got a little space to fill, because you've got some really small ones there, especially the new ones they added in the last update. They've got some really small ones, and they are perfect for filling in any little gaps. This area at the back here that I've just added in is going to have 3 functions. Well, 4 really. Function 1 is that it looks really cool, which is really important in these habitats. Function 2 is it's going to have the sign for the habitat in the middle to announce it. Its 3rd function is going to be a shelter for the otters in the center. And then finally, the staff buildings for the zoo, or some of the staff buildings for the zoo, are going to be built into these wings at the side. So in classic modernist style, it is all about function as well as form, and I really like how this turned out. This is actually based on the entrance, although heavily modified, so that there's a sort of continuity from walking through the entrance and then seeing this habitat, but there's going to be a lot of changes, so they're not just both the same. I'm going to get rid of most of these barriers now, or turn them into null barriers, because the concrete walls will keep the otters in. There's no need for any in-game barriers. Let's get on to the planting. So I created a sort of area of wetland looking vegetation in the Capybara walkthrough, which I spent quite a lot of time on. I was really happy with. So I'm going to copy and paste that into this habitat, and then just keep copying and moving and modifying things until I'm happy with it, and then put some sort of more unique foliage in at certain points to cover up areas or highlight areas that I want, like this little bit of moss here, and just keep playing with it until everything's perfect. And then put some logs in. I always like to have a log or two lying around You see that in real zoos because it provides enrichment for the animals, and it just kind of looks interesting. So we'll have 1 or 2 of those on the land, and I'm going to put one into the water as well. Put a load of bracken in, and just make sure that everything looks really rich and there's no sort of areas of nothingness. And then we will cover up the gaps between the path and the habitat with some of the faux rocks that I was talking about earlier that I like to use for this sort of thing rather than actually inside the habitat. So this makes everything look much nicer, and it also keeps the guests slightly away from the glass, which you would tend to do in a real zoo. And it covers up some of the slightly janky pathing around here. Terrain changes and paths, especially when water's involved, is not one of the easiest things to do in Planet Zoo, and this is going to look a whole lot nicer once I've finished putting all this stuff in. One of the things I really like about the faux rocks is that, as well as choosing the colour of the rock itself, there's a secondary colour for shadows, and if you make that green, you get a sort of mossy effect that blends in really nicely with everything else that I'm building here. And I'll put some of these much smaller rocks in as well, just for variety. I think this looks really nice when it's done, the way the path sort of melds into the habitat. And when it's all finished, I really like this habitat. As I record this, it is Tuesday morning on DLC release day. I am feverishly waiting for the update to be released so I can download it and add the otters into this habitat, and then do any final adjustments that are necessary and get some footage of them gambling around in the habitat and swimming about. So pretty busy day today. I finished episode 1 yesterday, which should have been released a couple of hours ago if you're watching this, but I cannot wait to download it, along with a new update as well. Some amazing new features in there, like the first person perspective camera and the new terrain tools, which I think are going to come in incredibly useful if they work the way that I think they're going to from reading the description. Let's finish off the shelter for the otters. So I'm using these tropical plant boards, which I really like. They're one of my favourite pieces. On the front here, just sunk slightly into those wooden planks to get a really nice effect. We'll put some signs on the front, and then we'll move on to the inside of the shelter and start building up the back wall for where the staff entrance is. So we'll keep it pretty simple in here. Some more of the dark wood, and then some more white concrete, of course, just to sit this staff gate in and make it all look perfect. And then inside the shelter, I'm going to have I forget what they're called, sleeping platforms or whatever. I think you're supposed to use them in the water, but they work just as well on land. And then we'll put a sign in. So we have a name, obviously, the Otter Pool, and I'm going to use these copper pieces to make a sort of art piece behind them. I've got to give credit to the wonderful Ina Meinung, who I built Pomoja Wildlife Park with. Well, she built Pomoja Wildlife Park and I helped out. That technique with the copper hexagons is something that she came up with for Pomoja Wildlife Park, which I really liked. We used it in the entrance there, come up with a new design using those same pieces to use here. We'll just do a bit more planting, and that is the Otter Pool complete. That's the Otter Pool. Time for the entrance aquarium. I'm really pleased with this. The aquariums on either side of it, which look like they're suspended, which you can't do in Planet Zoo, but they're not. It's just good angles, and the overhang of this concrete down here means that you can't see it. We've also got some little fish in there, which are the dandelion seed spawners, but they actually look pretty good, I think. And then some caiman statues as well, for a bit of variety. And we've got the same thing on this side. And this is where the guests would come in if the zoo is busy. Obviously we've only got 2 habitats at the moment, but they come down here and then they queue along here in order to get in. Got a nice sign up here, using a few different objects, some custom signage, a couple of habitats, enrichment items, and a load of wood. And then I've put some, I can't remember which stand these are, they might be the cupcake stands, but I've put these in for the entrance gates. And then over this side, I've made a little painting, which is the sort of thing I think you'd see in zoos in Florida. And in a lot of zoos have things like this, using some of the new signs and a lot of decals to make it look like the paint is, or to make it look like it's actually been painted on. We've got a security camera up there made by Beezy, another great piece that I would recommend for your zoos. And then one of Ricey's fonts, which we used in Capybara Country. I've just tried to make it look like it has actually been painted. And yeah, pretty pleased with how that turned out. Let's take a look at the whole thing. Looking good. We're going to move on and build an aviary now. And the aviary that I'm building is based on a real aviary. It's called the Bois de la Bâtie. It's in a park in Geneva, but we're going to be changing it for our purposes, because it's going to be housing the new red-crowned cranes, which I'm really excited to add to the zoo. It's been a long time since we had a new bird that wasn't a penguin, so this is a really cool opportunity to build something for them, and I'm going to take full advantage of that. So what we're building is an aviary based on suspended mesh. So I'm putting the mesh pieces in here and then curving them out slightly at the bottom and attaching them to these squares of plaster at the top. Don't worry too much about the squares of plaster, they're just there so I've got something to hang the mesh of. They will all be covered up with the roof later on. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to choose this aviary to base the design on, because the red-crowned cranes live in pretty cold environments in Asia, mainly in northern Japan and I think northern China and parts of South Korea. So they are actually birds that like a cold climate, not particularly suited to the Everglades. But I looked at zoos around the world that held them, and I found a zoo in Greece that holds them. I've not been to Japan or South Korea, but I have been to Greece and I know how hot it gets there. So I figure if they're okay in a zoo in Greece, then they will be okay in a zoo in the Everglades. But I wanted an aviary with a roof so that they would get shade. So this aviary has a roof all the way across it, and then the mesh hangs down from there. And I've put the mesh in so that it is sort of sweeping out slightly towards the bottom, because that's how it is in the aviary that I'm basing this on. And that is a pretty common feature in aviaries, but it does make it really difficult to work with, because when you have it coming out further at the bottom than it does at the top, when you try and copy the pieces next to each other, you're going to end up with gaps. So you have to be really careful with how you place these as you put the shape together. You can see it's a really organic shape, which is another thing I really liked about this aviary. That's why the plaster pieces at the top don't align, but we're going to replace those now with a roof, which will cover those up completely and give us a nice sinuous shape to the roof. And like I say, also provide shade for the cranes. Inside the aviary, of course, we're going to have a lot of water, with it being the Wetlands Zoo, and that is where the red-crowned cranes spend the majority of their time. So I'm using more plaster pieces here to create the roof, and just sort of experimenting with the shape of it. It's not an exact replica of the Bois de la Bâtie, it's more an interpretation of it, I guess. The original aviary is split into two, and it's designed from what I can see of it. I've not been there myself, but from what I can see of it, for fairly small birds. I think they had some species of pigeon in there, I think, maybe some starlings and things like that. I think the biggest bird I saw in there was some sort of pheasant or peacock. So these cranes are pretty big by bird standards. So I've made the aviary a lot wider and kept it all as one aviary rather than splitting it into two, so that we get enough space for the birds. And by the way, thank you so much for your comments and likes on this series so far. I'm really glad that you guys are enjoying this as much as I am. It's really allowed me to sort of stretch out and do different things to what I normally do in Tecton Zoo. I'm trying to do something new in each episode, experimenting with different designs and a different aesthetic. I am really enjoying it, so Thanks for watching, thanks for liking, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Anyway, enough of that rhubarb. Let's get back to this build. So I'm going to put in some guide ropes for the mesh using the new European cable pieces, which are enormously useful. I'm a big fan of these pieces. I've started using them more and more, and they are perfect for making the guide ropes that are going to come down here, and then just playing around with various different little pieces from the Europe pack until I find something that looks a bit like it might attach a cable to the floor. Just a little detail that you probably won't even see when you're looking at the build, but I like to know that it's there. And I'll just copy this around to the rest of the aviary. It also helps cover up any tiny little gaps in the mesh at the bottom, because I wasn't able to eliminate those completely. And if you're wondering how the structure's going to stay up, because it kind of just looks like it's floating at the moment, in the center of it are these pillars which are designed to look like sort of impressionistic trees, and they are what actually keeps the structure up, made of various different colors, various different shapes. They're not supposed to actually look like trees, they're supposed to resemble trees or call trees to mind, and they are a really attractive way of holding the structure up without impeding the view too much or getting in the way of the birds. While I finish that off, let's talk about the plans for the rest of the wetlands. So where we're building here is just after the capybara walkthrough. So this is going to be the next habitat that the guests get to, and there's going to be paths that will take them to both sides of this aviary so they can see it from either side, and that will enable them to choose which part of the zoo to get to after the cranes as well. So opposite the cranes we're going to have a lot more staff buildings, I think, to get the rest of the infrastructure into the zoo that we need. And then after that we're going to have some really big hoofstock habitats, one for the new wild water buffalo and one for the Nile Lechwe. So looking forward to making those. That's another thing that I have not done very much of, is making habitats for hooved mammals. So that is going to be a lot of fun to work out how to do that. I want to get some really, really beautiful landscaping in there, rather than this quite architectural stuff that we're doing here for the aviary. We're going to go the opposite and let nature do the work for us. By nature, of course, I mean me placing 1,000 trees and shrubs by hand. And as the path sweeps around there, I want to have a big flamingo lake as well. I did toy with the idea of having a massive aviary for the cranes and the flamingos, but as soon as I saw this design, I really wanted to put this into the zoo, and there was never going to be a way to adapt this to have both animals in. So I think a big traditional flamingo lake will sit really nicely next to these. And then after that, we're going to have an exhibit for the new crested newt. I've got a really cool idea for trying to make an aquatic exhibit that looks a little different to how you normally see them in the game. So I'm excited to get into that. And then after that, there's going to be a huge walkthrough for American alligators. Can't build a zoo in the Everglades without alligators. I'd originally designed something for the new spectacled caiman, but I realised that it would work much better for the alligators. So I'm going to come up with a different, more intimate habitat for the caimans, because they're a bit smaller. And then finally, in my plans at the moment, although there's still a few other animals, I may try and get in here a habitat for the platypus. I am very excited about that. I actually don't have a design for that yet. I'm waiting for the for inspiration to strike, because that needs to be a really, really good habitat, because that is an animal I'm absolutely fascinated by. I've never seen a platypus. They're very rare outside of zoos in New Zealand, and I've never been to anywhere in Australasia, actually, which is a shame. One day I really, really want to get to, well, ideally New Zealand, Australia, Papua New Guinea, everywhere around there, but certainly at least one of those places. But yeah, as soon as I've got a design for the platypus, you will know about it. And that at the moment is the plans for the zoo. Let's get back to this build. So I'm putting in the tree structures that I mentioned earlier here, which is going to keep this this roof where it should be. And I just love the modernist style support structures. These are copied almost exactly from the Bois de la Bâtie, not quite. They have a lot of perching birds in that aviary, so there's a lot more branches on the trees, but these storks aren't really big on perching, so I got rid of a lot of those and tried to make them a bit more solid looking and a bit more striking. Let's move on and get the paths in that I mentioned earlier. This is going to give the guests a choice of which way to go around the zoo. You don't want them all just going round one path all the way around the zoo. Obviously you're going to get congestion, etc. And then we'll move on to the final stage of the build, the inside of the habitat. I'm using the flatten to terrace tool. I finally understand what it does thanks to a tutorial from Rudi Rennkamel. So yeah, it is a bit counterintuitive, to be perfectly honest with you, but basically you have to sort of make a water body yourself, and then you can use the flatten to terrace brush to get it to a uniform size. And then finally, as I've done on the left here, you can use the offset to shallow pool option to slightly lower the terrain around the pool so that you get an area of really, really shallow water. I believe that is what the animals that can bathe are able to bathe in. Regardless, it just looks really cool. It's a great option once you get your head around it. So thanks to Rudi Rennkamel for his tutorial, because I had absolutely no idea what I was doing with that tool before that. And there we go. Water looks so much better with this tool. Gives you a lot more precision once you get used to it. Now we're going to move on to rocks and planting. You know I love my rocks, so I'm going to put an enormous rock in here and then mostly hide it in the terrain. So there's a sort of shelf out into the water, and then loads of small rocks here and there just to make things look a bit more interesting. I may have mentioned this before, but I am a huge fan of the rocks in this game. They're so well modelled and they can just completely transform anything you're building really just by placing these little guys around. So we're going to get a hell of a lot of these rocks in, along with a load more plants, especially sinking the really big rocks into the terrain so they sort of poke out in little places and then don't poke out in other places. That should get a really sort of rich look. And then the final build that we're going to do is just a tiny little shelter for the cranes. If they get too hot, this is going to go in the corner, maybe somewhere where they can nest as well. I'll put some coolers in it and a sleeping platform, and this can be their little base for when things get too hot. And then we've just got a little bit more planting and things like that to do. And this is one of my favourite parts of the build, when everything is coming together. We're going to put a few enrichment items in. I absolutely love the fact that you can recolour the feeder tray now. That's perfect, the way that just sits at the bottom of the water now, you barely even notice it's there. So we'll just get some really natural looking feeding from the birds in that part of it. And then you cannot do a build since the Europe pack without covering everything in periwinkle grass, of course, including Frontier, I noticed in the latest screenshots they shared for this pack. So yeah, this stuff is going to go absolutely everywhere because it just makes perfect grass, especially the way there's two different shades of it. Normally I use the sort of lighter green one, but for this Everglades Zoo I'm going with the richer, more vibrant green option. And then we're going to do something that you probably should do first, which is put the barriers in. I have to admit, I literally forgot to put barriers into this build until I got to this point. I was so concerned with my mesh, I forgot that that was just a construction piece and it wasn't actually a habitat. So we get that in, build a little shelter for the door for the keepers to access the habitat, which I'll mostly cover up later with some trees and some more periwinkle grass. And that is the build done. I love the scale of this aviary, it looks absolutely huge with the people next to it. And the red-crowned cranes are just majestic. We're going to move on now and take care of the zoo's first exhibits. Today we're going to be building a habitat for the brand new crested newt and the American bullfrog, but first, that looks good. I want to say a massive thank you to Tony Bridges in the comments on last week's episode. He lives in Florida and he gave me loads of great advice on making the Everglades look more like the Everglades. But here we are where we're going to be building today, just behind the red-crowned crane aviary. And what could be more boring than 4 exhibit boxes all in a row? Well, that is today's challenge. How do we make this look good? So I've got loads of different ideas on which way to go with this. And what I've ended up with is an absolute monstrosity of fake rocks. And I am really happy with the final result, despite it being pretty much the opposite of my usual style. So the first thing I wanted to do with the exhibits is split them into 2 areas and make it look like, rather than 4 4-meter boxes next to each other, there are 2 large exhibits, one for the American bullfrog and one for the crested newts. And I'm going to have them on different heights. So I discovered you could actually raise them away from the paths, and even if the path doesn't connect to it, the guests will still stop and look at it. So you can see here I'm going to raise the 2 central exhibits higher than the others, and then we're going to cover everything up with a mixture of concrete and fake rocks, so that hopefully it looks like one giant habitat split into 2 areas, one for each animal. So I'm using the concrete here just to make sure that none of the actual exhibits are still showing, raising the second one, and now we're going to start with the fake rocks. So these are going to cover the entire structure. The entire thing is essentially going to be built out of these fake rocks. In real life, I think these are made out of either fiberglass or poured concrete, depending on sort of what technique the zoo wants to use. And the one thing I do like about these fake rocks, I think I mentioned it before, is that you can use a secondary colour to add a bit of sort of moss to them, which makes them look a bit more realistic. But I am going for that kind of cheesy zoo feel here, rather than trying to make it look like they are real rocks. We want to make this look like a proper zoo exhibit. So we're going to use the rocks to cover up all the concrete, and just sort of split everything into the 2 different areas that I want, so that we have the bullfrogs on the left and the newts on the right. So none of the plaster will be visible by the end of this. It's just a matter of finding the right shaped rocks and putting them over everything, so that you end up with something that looks completely like it is made out of these fake rocks rather than anything else. Concentrating on making sure the guests can see into it. And the reason I've done 2 different heights is firstly because it looks more interesting, and secondly I always feel with the aquatic exhibits in this game that they are done in such a way that the guests are always looking sort of down on the water, and if you wanted to actually see into the water you'd have to crouch down, which if the animals are mainly underwater is not the best viewing experience, because you can't really see animals when you look into water from the top. You need to be looking into it directly from the side, like you're in an aquarium, and the aquatic exhibits in this game don't really do that. So I did 2 of each like this, so that in one the guest's eyesight is above the water level, so that they can see the frogs or the newts when they're on their little islands in the middle, and then in the central exhibits the actual eye line of the guests is below the water line, so they can see them underwater properly. I've put the maximum amount into each of these, so I think we've got like 12 bullfrogs and 8 newts, might be the other way around. And just to trying to make sure that there's always good viewing, there's always at least one animal on display, which is always a challenge with Planet Zoo's exhibits. And then we're going to carry on with some more rocks and start covering up these central columns, and I'm going to use the faux tree branches either side and on the central columns to add a bit more texture and a bit more interest to it, so it doesn't look too square. I want this to have a really organic feel, albeit organic in a very fake kind of way. And these tree trunk pieces are so useful. I really should use them more. Once you start putting more than one of them in and rotating them and combining them together, you can get some really good results. They look really organic. So anyway, we are building the roof here. Again, this is going to be built out of concrete, just so I've got a shape to work with, and then at the end all of the concrete will either be deleted or covered up with rocks, so that you can't see any of it. It's just to make sure that I know what I'm doing in terms of the space that we have. You can see the little area at the back, which is for the staff access, so there's no staff going into the front of the exhibits to clean them and getting in the way of the guests. That'll all be done in the inside of the building at the back, and then going to build up a big old pile of rocks here to serve as the roof. That font, by the way, is by the incomparable Ricey, and I think that fits in perfectly with the style that we're going for in this exhibit. And yeah, the facade's looking pretty good, but we still need to work on the sides and the back, and then add the finishing touches to the front that's really going to bring it to life and make it look absolutely perfect. So what I'm doing here is covering up the last remaining bits of concrete on the inside with the faux tree trunk and the faux tree branches to try and get a really organic kind of feel on the inside. So we'll just copy this branch around so that the circular window is covered up. And then we still get that nice shape of the window, but without the concrete kind of look. And then I wanted to use the rustic stone pieces as a backdrop. I see that a lot in zoos, almost like a dry stone wall, a bit like in the Machu Picchu build in Tecton Zoo. We're going to use that as the backdrop for the exhibits. I think it adds a really interesting look to the background of it with the texture of the rocks themselves, and of course it's only one piece, which saves time, which is always nice. And then we'll do some work on the sides and the back of the habitat to bring that up to scratch. So the intention is that you're not really going to be able to see these sides of it when you're in the zoo, but you can see this end that you're looking at now when you're in the Capybara Country walkthrough. And I'm sure you'll be able to catch glimpses of it, you know, wherever you are in the zoo, so it's important that it doesn't look terrible. So we'll put a bit of detailing in it, you know, some gutters, a few air conditioning units, power supplies, a few leaves up on the roof and things like that, and just make sure that it still looks decent wherever you see it from. But obviously the front of it, as in a real zoo, is the bit that you're going to concentrate on. That is the bit that the guests are going to be up close to. So that's the bit that you want to make sure looks really good. I'm also going to put some of the aquatic murals on it. I love these pieces. They are so zoo-y. They are really the kind of thing that you would see in zoos, but I hardly ever get the chance to use them because they don't really fit the style that I like to build in. So definitely grabbing the chance to use those in this zoo. And then just going to put some of the new cable pieces to act as sort of supports for the letters at the back, so they don't just look like they are floating. And put some foliage on the roof to break up the greyness of the rocks and just sort of have a bit of a pop there with the green. And then the final stage of detailing, so I'm going to use some of the faux rock steps to build away from the exhibit glass up to the roof. And once I spin these round, this looks really nice, I think. Ties the two of them together really nicely. I put some grills in as like sort of ventilation for the habitats, but I thought it was a bit much in the end, so I got rid of those. And then I'm going to use some decals to add some interest to the front and cover up the fact that it's just the same piece being repeated. It looks so good when you add them. And that's the amphibians done. I really hope you like this. It's way out of my comfort zone, but I really enjoyed building this. One of our best exhibit builds on the channel so far, I think. All right, let's turn our attention away from Florida, because today we're going to be turning a small part of Florida into India for the new wild water buffalo and some Indian peafowl as well. So I'm just making a little custom fence here, and then we're going to place it all around this area and get things underway. So we're building here just past the crane aviary. This is the path that's going to take people round in a loop to the rest of the zoo. I don't know about you, but these wild water buffalo, when the Wetlands pack was announced, they weren't really one of the animals that I was excited about, to be honest with you. But turns out I was wrong, because when I put the first of these into this habitat, wow, these guys are impressive. I kind of thought they'd just be like slightly larger cows, but no, these are some serious beasts, and they've got some serious horns as well. So I think I'd originally planned to have maybe 12 or so in this habitat, but I quickly revised that down to 6 with enough space for some babies as well. But yeah, I really like these guys. We are going to go pretty heavy on the theming with this. I want to get a real Indian vibe going on in this habitat. I'm going to concentrate on scenery, and it's going to have its own entrance. Just really set that Indian vibe for the guests when they get to this part of the zoo. So the part of India that we're going to be going for is the state of Assam, which is where most of the remaining wild water buffalo live. They are very rare these days, unfortunately. I'm lucky enough to actually have been to India. It's an amazing place. Chaotic beauty is how I would describe it. I'd highly recommend it. But I've never been to Assam. I've been to Mumbai and Goa. But I did some research as always, found some good reference photos, and that's what I'm going to try and evoke here. Obviously, we're going to have a wetland in the middle of the habitat for the buffalo, and then I'm going to fill the rest of the habitat and the entrance to the habitat with some buildings and structures and things inspired by the photos that I was looking at. So there's going to be a bit of clutter in this habitat. I like a bit of clutter, There's loads of Indian pieces in the base game already, which is really useful. So we're going to scatter a few of those around. And then the main feature of the habitat, apart from the landscape, is going to be a barn for the buffalo's shelter. And that is based on a barn that I found over in Assam, which we will build in a second. It was fun doing this. I don't normally use a lot of the sort of pre-made objects in game. Normally I just use the building pieces, so it's fun looking through all the different stuff that we have. So it's a real sort of low budget, falling down, slightly decrepit kind of barn feel, which is was the photo that I was looking at. That's what I'm going to try and capture here. Using these straw pieces. The walls are made of straw in the or covered in straw at least in the photo that I was looking at. Don't think I've ever used these straw pieces before. I think they're from the African theme, but they work really nicely. I really want this habitat to look run down and lived in and not like super cheesy zoo theming. Just try and make it feel like a field over in India rather than a super landscaped zoo enclosure, I guess. And then we've got something you see a lot of in India, which is this sort of rusted, old, corrugated roof. And it had a double roof, this barn, which I really liked, which I thought would make it interesting. It shouldn't look expensive or, you know, like some amazing design or anything like that. It should look like the sort of rundown, cheap barn that you would find in the countryside in that part of India. And I just love this double roof. I couldn't work out what purpose it served. I don't know if there's supposed to be anything up there, but it just looked unusual and cool while still being really sort of cheap and utilitarian, not like it had been sort of specially designed. There's two areas, a completely enclosed area where presumably they would spend the night, and then an open area where their food would be kept. We're going to put a load of custom wood pieces all around it to try and make it look structurally sound. Like a lot of these old barns, it should look like it's sort of falling down, but at the same time it's probably been there for decades and it's still fine, so it probably isn't actually falling down. That's the sort of vibe that I'm going for. And then on the inside, I'm using some feeders from a workshop pack by Leader. I've used his items a few times before. He's absolutely amazing at building these sort of detailed small objects, so always a good excuse to use anything that he's made. And then we're going to make a little sort of, I don't know what you'd call it, I'm not sure if it's a shrine, but it's like a small place, presumably for worship or once intended for worship. You see them all over India. Some of them are still used for that purpose, some of them are used for like advertising hoardings and things like that, so I wanted to try and replicate that here. Put a few of the Indian posters up, which are one of my absolutely favourite in-game items. I think these are amazing. Back when I first started playing Planet Zoo, these went absolutely everywhere because I didn't know how to build anything, and these were one of the in-game pieces that just instantly makes everything look good. But it's been a long time since I've used them, so I enjoyed putting them back in there. I'm just going to put a few more pieces on and get this looking the way I want it. The sort of dome on this, I think that's more of a sort of Islamic style minaret. It's from the North Africa pack, but that's the closest thing that we've got in the game for what I was looking for, so hopefully that's cool. Going to improve the in-game habitat gate and make it look like it's actually part of this fencing rather than just hide it, which is what I often do, but I decided to work with it this time, and seeing as we had a wooden fence, it made sense to use some of the wood pieces and make the gate sit nicely onto that fence and look like it's part of it. It's kind of weird building out of wood, not something that I ever really do in this game, but it's been fun trying all sorts of new materials and styles and things like that in this zoo. We're pretty much done with the habitat now. There's just one more thing that I'm going to add to it to bring some more Indian style in. We'll take a look at that in real time. The final bit of decoration I'm going to do is these flowers here to give it an Indian feel. Flowers are a big aspect of decorations and festivals and things like that over there. And because it's Flexicolor, we're going to put a little different coloured flower alternating between blue and pink on each fence post. I think this will give this a really Indian vibe. Now it's on to the other part of the build, which is to build an entrance for this little habitat. I wanted the habitat to have its own entrance, so you really feel like you are sort of going somewhere and in somewhere once you've passed under it. I think that's going to sell the sort of Indian flavour that we want here. So this is based on a national park in Assam, which I found a reference photo of the entrance to, just so when you get to this part of the zoo, you really feel like you're entering a different part away from the Everglades and into India, even though it's only one habitat. Just basically copying the reference photo, using a load of the wood pieces to get this sign up. A few decals, of course, to weather it a little bit more. I think these are the only decals I used in the entire build, if I recall correctly, which is pretty amazing by my current standards. Put some more wood around the sign. I'm going to shrink it a bit as well. It was a little bit big when I first built it, and then I'm going to get loads of vegetation in, make it nice and green and lush and welcoming. And then on either side, we're going to have these little brick pods. They actually had statues of rhinos in the national park that I'm copying this from. But I'm not going to have any rhinos in this zoo, so I didn't want to put those in. So I'm going to have a load of bamboo and some other flowers in here and use them sort of like flower beds. I really, really like these new, well, they're not new anymore, I guess, but from the Europe pack, these cobblestone wall pieces. The fact that they're recolorable just makes them so versatile. So we've really got this sort of sun-blasted, yellowed Indian kind of brick here, rather than the grey that you'd use normally. And I'm going to use some more European pieces for this little bit of fencing that goes around it as well. You see a lot of this kind of architecture in India, real mixture of European and Asian styles, especially in the older buildings there. Going to use those same flowers on here as well. I really like these. I think they give it a really nice sort of welcoming and very colourful look, which contrasts nicely with the more beige colours in the brick. And that is the build done. Really love the Indian vibes in this habitat. I'm enjoying it so much, we're going to put another Indian habitat next to it. We're going to be building a beautiful habitat for Binturong using only in-game barriers and normal construction pieces. The reason that I want to do that is that I always try in these videos, or I always hope that they inspire you to make your own habitats. And I know that some of you are going to be better builders than me, and some of you are going to be new to the game, or maybe you just don't have time to spend 4 hours rotating pieces to make one viewing gallery. And I thought it'd be cool to try and build something that's actually simple. So we're here in the new Indian area of the zoo. I took a look at what animals live in Assam over in India, and one of the first ones I saw was one of my absolute favorites, the Binturong. So we're going to build a beautiful but simple habitat for the Binturong right here. Let's get started. So I'm going to use the chain link barriers for this habitat. They're probably my favourite of the in-game barriers, not that I ever use them, but they do look like actual barriers that you would see in a zoo. I'm going to make this really tall, A, because Binturongs climb a lot, and B, because I think the taller the better when it comes to this kind of barrier. The taller it is, the less you sort of notice the barrier, I think, and the more you see what's inside. And then I'm going to split it in half because I want eventually to have something else on the other side of this, and the Binturongs don't need a large habitat. And then we're going to build a shelter. So I'm just using the normal log panel piece here. I'm going to have this raised up in the air because that's where Binturongs sleep, up in the trees. And then I'm going to try and make it as small as I can whilst still being usable by the Binturong. So the roof that I've just put in here is 1 metre above the base. And then we'll put a ramp in, one of the normal climbing ramps from the habitat menu. Ignore the little custom standoff barrier that's around the whole enclosure at the moment. I put that in the last episode. We're going to delete that and replace that with one of the in-game fences. And the key thing with this build is that although we are doing this as simply as possible, it still needs to look good at the end. So I'm using the Australian fence here, which is perfect for this park because it's rusty, which is exactly what you want in a hot, humid climate like this. And we're going to sink that down into the ground so that you can just see the top rung of the fence. It makes a nice standoff barrier, one of those barriers where you could step over it if you wanted, but it just tells people that they shouldn't be stepping past that point, which is what we need here. And then we're going to copy this all the way around the habitat, adjusting the height where necessary so it all looks nice and smooth. Alright, so we have that in all the way around the habitat, and we've got this little area highlighted here again, which was mostly done in the last episode. And that's just one plant and some of the aquatic rocks just to bring to life that little corner there. I've put the normal in-game anti-climb barriers around the habitat to keep the Binturongs in, and now we're going to get back to working on their shelter. So back to the log wall pieces. This log wall top is a great piece because the tops of the logs are different heights, which makes it much more interesting, and it actually looks like logs. You can see at the front of the flat roof piece that those log ends do not really look like logs, so we'll be covering those up. Now that I'm happy with this side of it, well, there's a bit more detailing to go in a second, we will double this in size and finish it off. So I'm using some of the separate log pieces to cover up the bits that I mentioned I didn't like the look of. And then while I was building it, I decided I wanted the Binturongs to be able to climb on top of it for enrichment purposes, and just because that'd be cool, give them something else to climb on. So I'm going to move it into the center of the habitat. Otherwise, obviously, they're just going to climb on top of it, jump over the fence, and you'll never see them again. So move it into here, and then just copy what we've already done over to the other side. And once we've done that, we'll get that ramp back in so the Binturongs can get in here. Just copy the logs across, use some of the smaller logs as well. Something I didn't realise when I was playing this game for absolutely ages is that once you've got a piece selected, you can select another piece in the menu at the bottom, and it will put that piece in the exact position that the piece you've got selected is. Why it took me like a year to discover that, I don't know, but that is really useful for building. And I'm going to cover this half of the front so it's nice and secluded, and leave the other half open so that we can put the ramp in, and the Binturongs will be able to climb up in here when they want to get away from the guests or just curl up and go to sleep. Now obviously we need to do a bit of detailing on this, so it isn't just 100% these logs, but the odd decal and maybe a bit of ivy or something like that, and I think that will do us. Need some legs as well, obviously, as it's floating at the moment, but yeah, this is a dead simple little shelter. I think when it's finished it looks really nice. What I'm going to do now is try and make these barriers a bit more interesting, so I'm going to raise them just at the back here around the shelter to keep the Binturong in their shelter so they can't jump off the roof and escape. And then I think once I've made these parts around here higher, I'm then going to make the entire enclosure even higher as well, because like I say, the higher you make these barriers, you almost forget that they're there. And then I've just put a few moss decals on the shelter. I'm going to add these ivy pieces in. I think they're called ivy pillars. There's only a couple of them, and they are more like one branch with a few leaves coming off it rather than the big spread of ivy that you normally get, and they are really useful for stuff like this. I don't want it to be like completely covered in ivy because that's a bit of a stock sort of Planet Zoo trick, so I just want to add a tiny few branches at the bottom here, and just makes it look a lot more interesting and takes away from the sort of gridded pieces look. That's pretty much everything with the shelter. Let's get on and start putting in all the foliage and all the stuff that's really going to bring this to life. So we'll put a bald cypress in the center of the habitat, which is a climbable tree. And obviously one of the most important things for a Binturong habitat is the climbing opportunities. You want to make sure that they're climbing as much as possible, because I want to see these guys up in the trees and on climbing platforms like this. We're going to spend the rest of the episode basically concentrating on getting the climbing right, and then you'll probably see the sort of the rest of the habitat growing around it, but we're going to concentrate on this aspect of it. So we've got a climbing platform there, and then this climbing bridge. So I want this to come off of the tree and then onto the climbing platform so that the Binturong can get up here. I noticed this tree wasn't quite wide enough to fix the bridge onto, so I'm going to switch it out with this tree, which has got a wider base, so that it looks like this is actually pegged into the tree. And then I'm also going to have climbing coming from the top of the shelter, like I said earlier, up into the tree. And we're going to put enrichment items around in places that they can only get to by climbing. That's one of the absolute keys to getting them to actually climb, is to give them things that they can only get to by climbing, so they've got a reason to get up there. We'll recolor all of these to a natural wood color, so it's a bit more subtle, and then put some legs on so it's not just floating in midair. And then we'll deal with the climbing coming from the top of their shelter. So this is always fun, working with the vines. I love these things. They're so good for the animals to climb on. They look brilliant. They actually move in the breeze, which is really cool. But wow, they are difficult to get in the right place. But it is absolutely vital that they are in the right place. I can't have them just connecting to nothing, floating about in the air. So we're going to do a lot of moving, rotating, etc. until finally it sits into the tree branch and it all looks good. There we go. And then we're going to put one last vine in that goes down to the ground to make sure that they can actually get up on top of this. They might be able to climb up the bits at the side, but I think logs that go across it stop them from doing that. So this makes sure they can definitely get up here. And we'll put an enrichment item up on the roof so they've got a reason to go up there. We've also got some leaves for them to have a little sleep if they fancy it. You can see the cardboard box item up there. And that is the climbing side of things pretty much done. Let's move on. We're going to use one of the temple pieces to put underneath the fence as a sort of concrete support, like they're sunk into concrete, which is what you want with a fence to stop it from blowing over, especially in the Everglades where it gets pretty windy. Some vines at the top of the fence just to make it look a bit more interesting. This is another advantage to having a really tall fence. You can put these big vines on it and it's not going to obscure the view of the guests at all. Then we'll put a sign in, little custom Binturong sign. I've got a tutorial on how to make these really easily. I'll put a link to that in the description if you want to watch that. There we go. Just colour it as well to suit the theme of the entire zoo with more of a cream colour than the black that is the default. And that is the habitat done. Love the Binturong, but we should probably get back to some more semi-aquatic animals. So a couple of weeks ago we built the wild water buffalo habitat, and you guys in the comments on here and Discord and Reddit seem to really like the custom fences that I built. So I thought the first thing that I'd do today is show you exactly how to build that custom fence. So I start with a 4-meter wall piece just to get the scale, and according to the Zoopedia, the Lechwe need 1.25 meters of fence to prevent them from jumping out. So I'm going to raise this about a quarter of a meter, so we've got a height of 1.25 meters altogether. And then the pieces that we need to build this are not in the construction tab, they are in the habitat tab. So we're going to hop over to there, type log into the search bar, and this brings up my favorite fence pieces. So we're going to be using the thin climbable logs and the normal climbable logs to make this. The normal ones for the sides like this, and then the thin ones for the logs that join between them. And we're just going to make the sort of normal wooden fence you see in any zoo, but for reasons unknown do not see in Planet Zoo. And that is going to give us a really nice sort of basis for this habitat. These are climbable logs, so I mean I can't think of a reason why you'd build a fence like this for an animal that could climb. But just be aware that as in real life, if you put anything that can climb in with a fence like this, they're going to climb out straight away. So we'll delete the fence piece, we don't need that anymore, and then let's put some mesh in to stop anything from getting underneath these wooden posts here. So I'm using the small mesh piece, sink that into where we want it to be, and then we'll just duplicate this along the bottom here, making sure it lines up so it looks nice and consistent. And when you get to the end, it'll overhang a bit, so we bring it back on itself and line it up nicely. And that's your fence. Group it together once you've got it all in a group. Depending on which way you're going to go, delete either the left or the right hand post so that when you start copying it round, you don't have an unnecessary piece. And that's pretty much it. So let's put this everywhere. We're going to lay out a big habitat for the Lechwe, and I'm purposely going to have the fence go through the big water area that we have here, because the whole zoo should look like it's been built in the Everglades, which is full of water already in this part of it. So this lake hasn't been man-made to fit this habitat. This is water that was already there. So we don't want an enormous habitat where the guests can't even see the Lechwe unless they get really lucky. So we're going to have the fence actually go through the water and adjust the height where necessary so it still acts as a barrier. And there we go, fence is done. So I'm just going to make a few adjustments to this last little bit here, so there's nothing janky going on, and then we will move on and build a shelter for the Lechwe. So this is based on a house that I found in South Sudan, which is where the Nile Lechwe live, along with Ethiopia. Really old house from an ancient town, which is, I don't know if it's you know, super ancient, or if it's been built in this traditional style of that area, but this is certainly some really old architecture here, and it had some really cool painting on it, which you can see here, and the whole thing is sun-baked and falling to pieces and cracked, and it just had this really cool sort of old African, it's been in incredible heat for centuries kind of look to it. So I decided I wanted to replicate that for this habitat and get something appropriate for the Lechwe. I'm using the African plaster cones from the Africa pack. They're really good for this build because they come in 3 different sizes and they're all really irregularly shaped. Yeah, there's just not a proper straight line anywhere on them, which is really useful. So I'm using them for this doorway here, and then I'm going to use them again to make the actual walls as well, because they sort of slope back on themselves, and then with that irregular shape you can copy them around and get a wall that doesn't have the sort of straight lines that you'd normally get if you used one of the wall pieces, which is going to be really useful for this build. I think they're built out of, I don't know, maybe clay or mud or something like that. So yeah, there's not a straight line to be seen, and I want to replicate that for this build. I started off building it really big. I think I got a bit carried away, so later on in the video you'll see it get a lot smaller when I realise how immense the build is. And again, I'm just going to use those same pillars upside down to create some towers at the end, and then just fill these walls around. So we've got a nice sizable shelter for the Lechwe. They're pretty shy, so we want to make sure they've got a lot of places where they're not in view of the guests if they're getting a bit stressed out. And they're just using loads and loads of the African pieces, and the round pieces I think are from the Australia pack, to get some designs on the walls. All this painting is copied from the actual real building. I've tried to give it a sort of faded look like the real building, and we're going to go crazy with the decals as well, so it's all covered in mud and scratches and just super weathered is the look that I'm going for here. I've tried to make the colours of the painting pieces as desaturated as possible as well, so they look like they've been in the sun for centuries. And yeah, just cover everything in decals, which I'm always tempted to do with all builds, but I have to sort of, you know, restrain myself, especially when I want something to look modern. But with this build, I can just let loose and put more decals on than I've ever used before. It really can't look weathered enough, to be honest. Now, hands up who knew what a Nile Lechwe was before the Wetlands pack came out. My hand is not up. But I consulted my centuries of accumulated knowledge, i.e. Wikipedia, and discovered that the Nile Lechwe, there's actually some debate about whether it's even should be called a Lechwe. It might be just a completely different species. I knew what a Lechwe was. I've seen them in zoos before, but I'd never heard of a Nile Lechwe. But yeah, apparently there is debate as to whether it should actually get like a completely new name. But they are really cool when you put them into the habitat. They're sort of half deer and half goat, which is quite a cool look. Something I did just then, which I think I did like way back in episode 1, which I always like to do, is to darken the walls on the inside of the habitat in order to make it actually look like it's in the shadow that it would be. For some reason, Planet Zoo's lighting engine doesn't really handle indoor as well as it does outdoor. So that's a little trick that I always like to do. So when you see them through the front door, it actually looks like it's inside. Otherwise you get this really weird effect where the back wall of a building with no windows in it is just as bright as the front door in direct sunshine, which is kind of weird looking. Time, as always, for lots and lots of lovely rocks. And that is the build done. And that's the Lechwe habitat. For the next habitat, we've got a specialty, a guest build from the amazing Romano Palacios. Let's check it out. And all the way around the back of the Wild India, in the center of the park, is the Flamingo Trail. So this was built for us by the wonderful Romano Palacios, and it is absolutely amazing. He is the king of planting in Planet Zoo. Don't think anybody does planting better than Romano Palacios for my money. And it is just a whole trail of incredible plants and these flamingos, which you can see on either side of the path all the way around. Yeah, I absolutely love this. This is one of my favourite parts of the zoo. And yeah, just a real masterpiece in garden design as far as I'm concerned. So we can continue round here and we'll end up back at the Nile Lechwe, and we can move on into the Crocs and Caimans area of the park. Let's get into building the Caiman River. So the concept for this habitat is to have a huge glass wall in front of the guests. I've seen some amazing Amazon exhibits and things like that in zoos and aquariums where it's like a cross section of a river. So the whole thing is underwater viewing. So that's what I'm building here. So the guests will stand in front of this, and then we're going to build it up inside. So it looks like a South American river, and then we're going to have both species of caiman in here. So the new spectacled caiman and Cuvier's dwarf caiman. I know the spectacled caiman are quite a bit bigger, but I've seen them kept together in zoos. So evidently the spectacled caimans don't eat the dwarf caimans, so those little guys will be perfectly safe. I want to give a big thank you to Romano Palacios again, using some landscaping from the flamingo habitat that we didn't end up using as a backdrop for this, and just heavily modified it so that it fits into the space that we have available to build here. This up here is going to be the land area for the caiman, and I'm going to go in and sort of tilt that slightly so there's better viewing. But the on-land viewing for the guests is going to be on the right-hand side as you look at it here. From the front, it is just going to be entirely underwater, which I think is going to look really cool. We're going to get these glass barriers as low as we can at the back so that they can't be seen. And then at the front we'll have them a bit higher so the caimans can't jump out. And you can see that blue object in there. That is a 3-meter wall piece, because the caimans need, I think the spectacled caimans need 3 meters to dive. So I need to make sure the water is more than 3 meters deep, which is why I've dug out the bottom of the river as well. There's a waterfall in here that was already there, made by Roman, so thanks for that. And that is going to sort of power the water that flows along this river. So all the barriers and paths are in now, which is always the most difficult thing when you're building something that has water in it. So we're going to tidy up this grassy area for the caiman here, and then we're going to finish off the sort of aesthetics of the front of the build. So I'm going to build some poles to replace the in-game glass dividers. Just using a couple of these pieces, but I really like how this turns out in the end. I went through loads of different attempts at this before I got something that I was happy to use. So we'll copy this across and cover up all of the glass dividers at the front and in the viewing window on the side as well. And then, much as I love the sort of infinity pool look that we had here, which I really makes me really want to build an infinity pool. Obviously the caiman would just be able to jump out and either fall to their deaths or just eat the guests, depending. So that needs to go. So we're going to raise that up a lot higher to keep the caiman in here, make some more little adjustments to them, and then we'll sort out some of the rock work at the front of the habitat as well, make sure that's more polished. And then we're going to move on and start working on the underwater area. I wanted this to be really, really lush and really dense and full of foliage, and just looking like a proper sort of Amazonian river rather than just a sort of tank of water. Now that's pretty tricky in Planet Zoo, because you put anything in here with a hitbox and then the caiman aren't going to be able to swim there, and it's just going to completely ruin the underwater environment. So primarily you need to do that with items that don't have a hitbox, like these plants. And what I found really useful was the water lilies. I didn't particularly think about having water lilies in terms of the sort of leaves and the flowers at the top, but because they've got these big roots dangling down, that enabled me to fill the water with stuff basically without affecting the traversable area of the caiman. We're going to put a little door in here. This is where the habitat's gate is hidden behind here, so I'm going to put a door in there so it doesn't look like the keepers are just walking out of the solid rock, and then use some of these marula trees to cover it up from where the guests are standing, so it's not too visible when the guests are stood on the paths that we're putting in here. And then above the door, I'm going to put in a security camera made by my boy Beezy. It's such a great piece, this, and it's flexi color as well. This will just enable the keepers to make sure they're not about to get nipped by a caiman before they come through that door, because it doesn't have any glass in it. And then I'm going to put a sign in using one of Ricey's amazing fonts. This is going to go above the habitat. It just looks really cool, I think. Put some seats in here for the guests, make a little seating area, just using the same seats that we used in the Capybara walkthrough, which are basically the aquatic seats with some concretes underneath them. And then we're going to take care of the elevated viewing path that I put in earlier. We're going to cover this with yet more rocks. You can't have too many rocks in your builds, and just make this sit in nicely with the rest of the habitat. I was using this path originally because this is one of the better looking paths in the game, I think, and it's one that's got realistic railings, but in the end I didn't like how it changed suddenly from the log chippings that we've used throughout the rest of the zoo onto this wood, so I decided to use the log chippings again, remove the railings, and then build custom railings using the Australian fence pieces that we used when we built the Binturong habitat. I almost forgot as well, we had another milestone on the channel yesterday, which I am very happy about. We hit 2,000 subscribers, which is amazing. So thank you all for subscribing. It means a lot to me, and that is a really pleasing milestone to hit. I've not prepared a montage this time because I did one for the Tecton anniversary like 2 weeks ago or something, so no need for another one of those. So we're getting to be nearly completed with this build. Just need to put those railings in that I mentioned earlier, and then some enrichment for the caiman. And we are almost finished with the wetlands. We have 2 more habitats to build. A habitat that I have been looking forward to ever since they announced this pack, which is for the platypus. I've got a crazy idea for that habitat. I have no idea if I'm going to be able to build it or not, but I'm going to give it my best shot. That should be the next episode. And then finally we'll build the big alligator walkthrough, which you can see off in the distance just past this build here. So almost time to put the caimans in. We just need to put some enrichment items in the habitat for them. So I'm going to be using a couple of the new underwater feeders, which are flat, which I really like because they take up much less space. And then, as always with this type of animal, we're going to be hiding one of the mud baths into the floor using some more foliage and these awesome dead leaves that Roman made. And then it is time to get the caimans in. Thanks to Roman's help, this build came together pretty easily, but the next one was a lot more difficult. Welcome to the build that almost ended me. I don't know about you guys, but the crashing in Planet Zoo, in this zoo anyway, right now is like every 10 minutes. And it has made building this almost impossible, but somehow I got there. So we're going to take a look at it. So this is going to be a habitat for the platypus. I'm so excited to build this. These were one of the animals that I was really looking forward to making a habitat for as soon as they announced the wetland pack. And I came up with the idea of trying to make basically the smallest habitat I've ever built. I thought that would be really cool, just to have like a little pool for them. I did my research as always, and the platypus needs next to no space to be happy. They basically spend their entire lives either sleeping in a little burrow they've made in a riverbank, or swimming around in the river outside their burrow, eating anything that wiggles. They basically don't use land, so they're either in their burrow, or unless you catch them in the sort of 5 seconds it takes them to scramble from their burrow into the water, they have no use for land. So I figured we could basically go ahead and make them a habitat with virtually no land in it, and make it all deep water for them to swim in. Originally there was going to be 2 of these with differing water heights, but as you will see, I've skipped all of the crashes out of the video. Obviously that doesn't really make for good viewing, but every time you hear a record scratch, that is my game crashing, and this happened so many times. I lost so much work because of this. So let's get on to the build, and that was a whole different kettle of fish in terms of difficulty as well. I thought this would be really simple, but for reasons which will become apparent in a minute or so, it was not. But the concept was to have this sort of low glass barrier for the guests to look into, and then we'd have the water positioned at such a height that the guests can see the platypus sort of from above looking down, and then also from underwater if the guests crouch down to look under the water level. I've seen this done in zoos, not with platypus. I don't think I've ever actually seen a platypus IRL. They're really rare outside of Australia and New Zealand in terms of zoos. And then we just have a little burrow next to the water. And then I discovered that you can't put the burrow enrichment item in within about 5 meters of the nearest water source, or within about 3 meters of the nearest habitat gate, which is a big problem when you've built a habitat as small as this. So mucking around with the barriers, moving the gate around, you can see from the red colour that no matter what I try to do, I just cannot get the burrow anywhere within the back wall of the habitat, which is the white plaster there. So I came up with a cunning plan, which was to build a fake burrow inside the habitat and put the actual burrow behind the habitat with null barriers around it, so that the habitat is actually twice the size that it appears to be. And amazingly, somehow I got this to work. It took a lot of doing, but I ended up with a habitat as tiny as I wanted it to be, that is fully functioning. The platypus can dive underwater, the platypus go into a burrow, and you can see the platypus in the burrow on the burrow cam that we're going to link up later. So eventually I got there. That was very pleasing, and having got the mechanics of the habitat working, now we need to make it look good. So I've built a sort of fake burrow entrance out of the rocks here, and I've got a little platypus in here to test it. We're going to see how sort of small we can make this and have them still be able to walk through it on the heat map there. And having made this just with a few rocks and then dug this awful looking hole into the back of the habitat, now we need to do a lot of terrain work to get this to look good and sort of in keeping with the quality of habitat that I like to think that we have in this zoo. So the one issue is when you bring the platypus into the habitat, you have to manually move them over the wall into the habitat itself. But that's fine. I can't put like a ramp in or anything, because in order to get a ramp up and then down, obviously they'd then be able to just climb out of the habitat and get back in again. And later on I'm just going to take a couple of bricks out of that wall at the back and cover it up with foliage so that the keepers can get in and out and refill all the water feeders. So we paint in the inside of the burrow so it looks nice and natural, or at least it will do once I've put enough plants and stuff covering it up. And then we're going to go in with planting. Now you're probably wondering at this point, where have all the trees gone? So like I say, this game is crashing every 10 minutes or so when I'm trying to build this. And I was thinking that maybe one of the potential reasons for this, which is something that Romano Palacios noticed when he was building in the zoo, is that with the completely pointless bald cypress trees that I built back in episode 1, each one of those is made up of, I think, 8 pieces, and I have literally thousands of them covering the entire map in groups of about 4,000 pieces each. So I was thinking maybe I'm just taxing the game too much, The frame rate's fine, but you know, maybe I'm using too much memory or something like that. So I deleted every tree in the zoo, and it made no difference whatsoever. I was still getting crashes all the time. So in the end, I saved this habitat as a blueprint and then brought it back into the file that still had the trees in. So the trees haven't really gone anywhere, don't worry about that. But yeah, that's why it looks really weird. I've also been through loads of different color schemes with this habitat, and I've ended up going with something really simple, which you'll see in the final result. And yeah, I'm really happy with the habitat itself, especially with how small it is. Having worked with franchise mode for the majority of the time I've been playing Planet Zoo, it's really nice to be able to build a cute little habitat that is the right size for the animals, rather than being at the absolute top end of the recommended size for the animals. So I'm dressing up the sort of riverbank here with a load of roots and some reeds, and then we'll do some work on the underwater part of the habitat, which as you can see is a load of one of my favourite pieces, the smallest temple rubble piece, and then some underwater plants as well, just to give it a nice interesting look and get away from the sort of bare terrain that you get by default. And we're going to do a load more rock work above ground as well to get everything looking good and take away from the sort of patch of mud followed by a patch of grass that's in there at the moment. And I'm so happy with how this looks when it's finished. This, I know I said this last week about the Caiman River, but this might be my favourite habitat in the zoo, and I'd be really interested to know actually. As I've mentioned numerous times before in this series, I'm really trying to make every build different and try and make each build different from the sort of builds that we would do in Tekton Zoo. Although this one is a little Tektonish, I must admit. I've tried to make it less so, trying to make it really colourful and take away from the sort of white concrete look. But there is definitely a sort of Tektony kind of feel to this habitat, less so when it's finished, I think. And that leads me on to my question for this week. What I want to know is, what is your favourite habitat in the wetlands? I'd be really interested to know, if all the different sorts of builds that I've done each week, I want to know what is your favourite, which one did you like best? I think that'll be really helpful for me going forward in terms of what kind of things you guys like and what kind of things look best. So here we are now back in the proper zoo with all the trees. Oh my god, it looks so much better like this. That is the platypus. Let's check it out. So that's the platypus, a nightmare to build, but well worth the trouble. Time for the final habitat. We are in the lake that we dug out way back in episode 1, and we're going to be building the alligator walkthrough. So as you can see, it is a huge area here. This habitat is going to take people from the Caiman River that we built a couple of weeks ago, all the way around to the platypus habitat that we did last time. And yeah, it's going to be pretty big. So the first thing that I want to do is make sure that no little kiddies are going to be diving into the alligator lake. So we're going to be putting mesh all the way around this path. I'm using this path, I think I tried to use it in the Caiman River and then decided not to, but this has got my favourite railing on it. It's one of the few railings, in my opinion, that actually looks like something you might see in a zoo. But it doesn't have anything in between the bits of wood that are holding up the rail itself, so we need to put some mesh in to get that a bit more suitable. And then we're going to put the fences all the way around with a few null barriers underneath the path so that it works as a single habitat. And now we're going to put some land in quite near the path to give an area for the alligators to bask on and put their food on and hide some bedding in rocks and things like that, so that guests get a good view of them. And then we're going to have a bridge going across it. I'll get rid of this land in a minute so that the keepers can get there. This is using the African hut base, which is one of my favourite pieces in the game for this kind of thing. I always use this when I'm making any sort of log bridges rather than using the log pieces. And then I'm just going to use one of the standard fences for a bit of protection for the keepers as they're walking down here. It's been a lot of fun building something like this. I built an alligator swamp in Tekton Zoo, which is actually sort of a similar design, but trying to combine that with modernism in a pretty small space, whereas here we get to go crazy and just build a massive habitat. No concrete anywhere, it's all going to be wood. I really want this to look like a classic American gator habitat, where the guests would walk around it. Health and safety, not something to worry about. It seems in American zoos or Asian zoos as much as we do in the UK, which makes it a lot more fun to build in this style. I'm going to hide some rocks for them to sleep on, one of the mud baths as well. As always, we're going to disguise this, and this is going to be really up front and center, as you can see from the path there. So I spent a lot of time on this, making this look really nice. This is sort of one of the centerpieces of the habitat. The other one we'll get to later, which is my favorite part of the build. I had a lot of fun building that. But we'll get to that in a bit. Just gonna finish this off, make this look as good as possible, using all sorts of different plants to hide the edges of this and just make it look more natural. I just checked and it's been 3 months, almost to the day, since I started building the Wetlands Florida. A couple of days after Frontier announced the Wetlands pack, and I've had a lot of fun in this zoo, trying to come up with different styles of building for each habitat. And in this one, we are very much in gator land, classic American gator habitat territory. So we can't rely on any architecture or buildings or anything like that. It's all just going to be wood and plants and water and land, basically, trying to make that look good. So paying a lot of attention to the planting in the habitat, and we'll do a whole load of terrain painting later as well. I really like the effect of having long grass underwater. That's something I do a lot, doing a lot of that here. Just makes it look really dynamic and green, and sort of simulates the sort of underwater plants and grasses that you would get in a place like this. And I'm dropping in some of the sort of groups of vegetation that I've used all over the zoo here. I've built one of these sort of smaller shrubby with the odd palm bits, and then one of the big bald cypress trees everywhere, and I've dropped those all over the park to give it a continuity and make it feel nice and lush. And all the enrichment items are going to go here as well to give the alligators a reason to sit on that island so that the guests can see them. Now, onto my favourite part of the habitat. So one of the classic sort of alligator viewing experiences is the way of feeding them, where they have to sort of rise up out of the water in order to get some meat, which I've never seen IRL. Obviously I've seen it on TV, YouTube, etc. We don't have anything like that in Planet Zoo, so I decided to build one. Obviously it won't actually function, but it does look cool, and it sort of provides a centerpiece for the habitat. So I'm creating an area here where it's going to go, and then we're going to build a custom sort of feeding station with a bit of meat on it for the alligators to jump up and get it. Now I end up changing the layout. This is my first attempt at it, and this is where I built the actual sort of feeding station itself. So this layout changes a bit later. But what I was trying to do originally was combine an animal talk point so that there would be an educator stood here to look like they were feeding them, and a rotation line feeder so that we get the rope dangling down for the food. So putting it together here, and then at some point I realized that I didn't actually want the animal talk point to be there. It would look better if I moved the animal talk point and then simply forced a keeper to stand in this spot using a barrier, and then we wouldn't actually need to have the animal talk point in the same sort of structure as everything else. So at the moment I'm just covering it up using some of these East Asian pieces to make a big column. It's going to go all the way down to the terrain below the water, make it look nice and strong. And then I love this new trowel piece, so I thought this would be good for sort of getting the meat onto the enrichment item itself. So I've stuck that to the side with one of the new, I think it's a hanger piece. And then using the new spade handles to create a handle for the mechanism that would lift this up and down. They're all recolorable, the items in the new conservation pack, and they are so good for building small things like this. So just getting that to match up so it looks like one mechanism, and then drop this guy in, and by putting a barrier on the floor he's got nowhere to go, so he just stays where you put him, which makes it look like he's there permanently. And then I'm going to use a few of these art shapes, I think they're Australian signs actually, to make a bit of meat that is suspended from the edge. and then we can imagine the alligators jumping up to get it. You'll see them swimming past it, at least in the cinematics at the end. Next up, I'm going to put these in. So these are there to stop alligators from getting up onto the path, or the guests from dangling their hands down or whatever, just making sure there's a definite separation between alligator and guest, which is always useful. This is just a couple of the, I think they're the Europe Pack pieces. In fact, no, it's from the Europe Pack and then the same bracket that I just used. Put in this amazing custom tree that Romana Palacios made for us in the Flamingo Trail as a sort of centerpiece for the island. It's so good, I wanted to use it again. It's made of loads of the Sudanese frankincense tree stuck together with a load of moss and other things. I absolutely love that, it's so cool. Putting some more rocks in for them to bask on. I'm just tidying up some of the rock work that I've placed around the edges of the habitat. We'll put a load more trees in and things like that around the side as well. I want it so wherever you stand in this habitat, wherever you are looking, doesn't matter what direction, it's just going to look really, really lush from every possible angle. Going to put some supports in for the bridge, so it's not just sort of floating on the water. This is another great piece. This is base game, I think. It's the African scaffold, I think it's called, which is really good to use as a support for wooden bridges and things like that. On the rare occasions that I build anything out of wood, this is one of my favourite pieces. It's so well made. I love the little ropes on it, keeping the separate bits of wood together. I'm going to hide the bark rubbing enrichment in this tree. I've not seen them use it yet. I hope it works. I've done that before with the red pandas in Tecton Zoo, and I've seen them use it, so hopefully that will work. And then I'm just going to use these rocks to create a few more sort of islands around the lake to keep the alligators more where the guests can see them. It's 1 male and 5 females is the maximum that you can have for them to be happy. Now obviously we're in sandbox mode, so I can just ignore that, but what I did was put more mesh fences underneath the path using the mesh pieces to in effect create 2 habitats. So there's a male and 5 females in the direction that we're looking now, and then another male and a female behind there. Gonna put a nice sign in to sort of start the habitat off and announce it. We'll do the same at the other end, put some gates in here for the staff paths, and that is the alligator walkthrough done. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you so much for watching this series. I'm so happy that people have enjoyed this one. Let's check out the gators. And that is the whole of the Wetlands, Florida. Thanks for watching. If you want to see the tour of the finished park, then click on this video on the screen now, and I'll see you again soon. Bye.